The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across my perfectly manicured lawn, the scent of fresh-cut grass and blooming jasmine hanging heavy in the air. My name is Helen, and for the past 30 years my life's greatest joy has been my daughter Clara. Watching her build a life that seemed plucked from the pages of a storybook was the fulfillment of all my maternal hopes. Her husband Mark was the cornerstone of that perfect life. He was handsome, successful in finance, and utterly devoted to her. They were the golden couple, their happiness a warm, radiant light that touched everyone around them. Their home was a testament to their success, a beautiful modern house in the city's most exclusive neighborhood, and their love seemed as solid and unshakable as the foundation it was built upon. The only shadow that ever fell across their idyllic world was the tragic story of Mark's past. He was an orphan, his parents gone too soon, and his identical twin brother Ethan had been lost in a horrific boating accident a decade ago, long before Clara had met him. Mark rarely spoke of it, but when he did, his voice would grow thick with a grief so palpable it was heartbreaking. He was the sole survivor of his family, a detail that only made Clara's, and my own, love for him that much deeper. We were his family now, and we cherished the responsibility of filling the void that fate had so cruelly carved into his life. One quiet Tuesday evening, as I was preparing a simple dinner for myself, a firm, unfamiliar knock echoed from my front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. Clara had called earlier to say she'd be stopping by after her yoga class, but that wouldn't be for another hour. Wiping my hands on my apron, I walked to the door and peered through the peephole. A man stood on my porch, his back partially to me, as he looked out at the street. He was tall and broad-shouldered, and when he turned, my breath caught in my throat. It was Mark, but it wasn't. The resemblance was uncanny. The same strong jawline, the same dark, wavy hair, the same intense green eyes. Yet, this man was different. He was leaner, his face etched with hard lines Mark didn't have, and there was a thin, silvery scar that cut through his right eyebrow, a blemish on the familiar perfection of my son-in-law's face. His clothes were worn, a simple canvas jacket and faded jeans, a stark contrast to Mark's usual tailored suits. He looked weathered, like a man who had been sculpted by hardship, not by success. A flicker of confusion turned to irritation. Was this some kind of prank? A long-lost cousin, trying to trade on a family resemblance? I opened the door a few inches, the security chain still in place. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice cooler than I intended. He turned his full attention to me, and his green eyes, so like Mark's yet so different, held a profound, weary sadness. "I'm looking for Clara," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sound. "My name is Ethan." Just as the impossible name left his lips, Clara's car pulled into the driveway. She hopped out, a yoga mat tucked under her arm, humming a cheerful tune. "Mom, I forgot my keys, can you believe it?" she called out as she walked up the path. She looked up, saw the man standing on my porch, and froze mid-step. The color drained from her face, her cheerful smile collapsing into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. A sound tore from her throat, a blood-curdling scream that shattered the peaceful evening air. A sound of such visceral terror that the birds in my jasmine vines scattered into the sky. Her yoga mat and her purse clattered to the ground. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror that went beyond mere shock. "Mark?" she stammered, her voice a strangled whisper. "No, you can't be. You're dead." She took a stumbling step backward, her body swaying as if she were about to faint. The man, Ethan, took a step towards her, his hands raised in a placating gesture, his face a canvas of sorrow and regret. "Clara," he said, his voice gentle. "It's me. I'm not who you think." But Clara was beyond reason. She was trapped in a nightmare, staring at what she could only believe was the ghost of her husband's long-dead brother, a specter who had inexplicably taken the form of her living husband. It was a scene of such raw psychological chaos that my own mind struggled to process it. I quickly unlatched the chain and rushed to Clara's side, wrapping my arms around her trembling body. "It's okay, sweetheart, it's okay," I murmured, though my own heart was hammering against my ribs. To the man I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and anger, "You need to leave. Right now. This is a cruel, sick joke, and I am calling the police." The man, Ethan, just looked at us, his expression one of profound pain. "This is not a joke," he said, his voice heavy with a sincerity that was unnervingly convincing. "I am Ethan. I am Mark's brother. I just need to talk to him. Please, just tell him I'm here." Clara began to sob hysterically, burying her face in my shoulder, her body racked with violent shudders. Her terror was so absolute, so genuine, that it was impossible to doubt her belief that she was seeing an apparition. I steered her towards the house, my protective instincts overriding everything else. "Leave now, or I will call the police and have you arrested for harassment," I repeated, my voice now sharp with authority. He held my gaze for a long moment, his green eyes filled with a deep, unspoken sorrow, before he finally nodded slowly, turned, and walked away down the street, disappearing into the twilight like the ghost Clara believed him to be, leaving a crater of confusion and terror in his wake. Once inside, I settled a still, sobbing Clara onto the sofa, her hysteria slowly giving way to shuddering, exhausted breaths. I called Mark, my fingers fumbling with the keypad. "You need to come over right now," I said, my voice urgent. "Something terrible has happened." He arrived in less than 10 minutes, his face a mask of concern. He knelt before Clara, taking her hands in his. "My love, what is it? What's wrong?" Between broken sobs, she recounted the story of the man on the porch, the ghost who looked like him, the man who called himself Ethan. As she spoke, I watched Mark's face, and what I saw was a masterful performance. His expression shifted from confusion to a deep, gut-wrenching grief, his eyes filling with unshed tears. He pulled Clara into a fierce embrace, burying his face in her hair. "Oh, my darling, I'm so sorry," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. He then looked at me, his eyes shining with pain, and retold the tragic story of Ethan's death, a story I had heard before but never with such raw, convincing detail. He spoke of a sudden storm on the lake, the capsized boat, the desperate search in the icy water, the heartbreak of finding only a piece of the wreckage. "They never found his body," he finished, his voice cracking. "There are sick, cruel people in this world, Helen. Con artists who read obituaries and prey on grieving families. I can't believe someone would do this to us." His performance was flawless, his grief seemingly bottomless, and Clara clung to him, finding solace in his words, her terror slowly being replaced by his righteous anger. "He's dead, Mom," she repeated, her voice muffled against his chest. "I know he's dead. Mark told me everything." They sat there, a perfect tableau of shared grief and resilience. A husband and wife united against a cruel world. Mark looked at me, his expression pleading for my belief. "We'll file a police report in the morning," he said firmly. "We'll put a stop to this. No one will ever hurt my family like this again." He was so convincing, so utterly believable, that for a moment I was swept up in his narrative. The world he painted, one of tragic loss and the cruel machinations of strangers, made more sense than the impossible alternative, that the man on my porch was real. But as I watched them, a tiny, cold seed of doubt began to sprout in the back of my mind. Their reaction felt too polished, too perfectly aligned. There was no room for confusion, no flicker of what if. It was an immediate, absolute, and shared denial, as if they were reading from a script they had rehearsed for years. Why not a moment of stunned curiosity? Why not a sliver of doubt? Why only this perfectly packaged story of a con artist, delivered with such theatrical pain? After they left, with Mark promising to stay by Clara's side all night, the silence of my house felt different. It was no longer peaceful. It was menacing, filled with the echo of Clara's scream and the weight of Mark's perfect, heartbreaking story. I couldn't shake the image of Ethan from my mind. He hadn't looked like a con artist. There was no cunning in his eyes, no rehearsed lines. There was only a deep, bone-weary sadness, the look of a man who had traveled a long, hard road to get to my door. The scar on his eyebrow was a detail that nagged at me. It felt too real, too specific, an imperfection that a grifter trying to impersonate a perfect man like Mark would likely have covered up. Clara's scream, too, replayed in my mind. It was the sound of a fundamental belief being shattered, the shriek of a person whose reality had been torn apart. It was a reaction to the impossible made real, not to a mere impersonator. A deep, instinctual unease settled over me. I had always trusted Mark implicitly, loved him like a son. but the certainty with which he and Clara had rejected the impossible felt, in itself, impossible. Something was profoundly, fundamentally wrong with the story I had been told. My unease propelled me from my chair. I needed something tangible, some piece of evidence to either confirm Mark's story or validate the terrifying doubts that were beginning to consume me. Mark was notoriously private about his past. He claimed that all of his family's photographs and documents had been destroyed in a house fire years after his parents' deaths, a convenient tragedy that had effectively erased his history before Clara. He had no childhood photos in their home, no ties to his past. He was a man who had started his life the day he met my daughter. But I remembered something. In Clara's old bedroom, in a closet filled with boxes of her past lives, college textbooks, forgotten hobbies, high school yearbooks, there might be something. She had been a sentimental pack rat, and I knew she had kept albums from every stage of her life. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a photo from the very beginning of their relationship. Something from before Mark had curated his own history, before the supposed fire had so conveniently wiped the slate clean. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot I had. My heart pounded with a nervous energy as I climbed the stairs to the room that had been dormant for years, now a potential archive of a truth someone had tried very hard to bury. I spent the next hour in the dusty silence of the spare room, surrounded by the ghosts of my daughter's youth. I pulled down box after box, the smell of aging cardboard and memories filling the air. Finally, at the bottom of a large plastic tub labeled College Days, I found it. A small, leather-bound photo album from a spring break trip to Mexico that Clara and Mark had taken the year they got engaged. My fingers trembled as I opened the cover. The photos were filled with the bright, carefree joy of young love. There they were, smiling on a sun-drenched beach, raising margarita glasses in a crowded cantina, kissing under a palm tree. I turned a page, and my breath caught in my chest. It was a picture of Mark, standing alone by the water's edge, laughing at something Clara had said from behind the camera. He was shirtless, his skin tanned from the sun, and there, on his left shoulder, was a small, dark birthmark, shaped exactly like a tiny crescent moon. I had seen it 100 times when they visited in the summer, a familiar, intimate detail of the man my daughter loved. A jolt, cold and electric, shot through me. I closed my eyes, forcing my mind back to the man on my porch just hours ago. Ethan. When he had reached out a hand towards Clara, his jacket sleeve had pulled back, revealing his forearm. I remembered it with perfect, sudden clarity. His arm was bare, unmarked. There was no crescent moon. The truth slammed into me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. The man on my porch was real. He was Ethan, and Mark, my perfect son-in-law, had a birthmark that his identical twin did not. It was a small, irrefutable detail that invalidated their entire story. The man Clara married was not the man who had just walked away from my door. This whole time, there had been two of them. The tragic story of the boating accident, the convenient house fire that destroyed all records, the immediate and aggressive denial of Ethan's existence. It all snapped into a horrifying, cohesive picture. My son-in-law was not a grieving twin. He was a liar on a scale I could barely comprehend. My daughter, my beautiful, trusting Clara, was married to a man who had faked his own brother's death, a man who was living an elaborate, monstrous lie. A cold, terrifying fury began to replace my shock. The maternal instinct to protect my child, which had driven me to comfort Clara earlier, was now directed at the source of her future pain, her husband. I had to find Ethan again. I had to understand the depths of this deception. They had underestimated me, seeing me as a gentle, non-threatening mother-in-law. They had no idea I was about to become the one person who would systematically dismantle the comfortable, fraudulent world they had built. The revelation of the birthmark settled not like a gentle dawn, but like a flash of lightning, illuminating a landscape of monstrous deceit in a single, blinding instant. My son-in-law was not Mark, the grieving sole survivor. He was an imposter who had stolen his brother's life. The man on my porch was the true Mark, the one cast out and left for dead. The scream that had torn from my daughter's throat was not a reaction to a ghost, but the primal shriek of a soul recognizing a truth it had been conditioned to deny. The perfect, storybook life Clara cherished was a meticulously crafted fiction, and its author was the man she shared a bed with. A cold, terrifying rage, purer and more potent than any emotion I had ever felt, washed over me, extinguishing all shock and confusion. My first instinct was to call Clara, to scream the truth into the phone and shatter her beautiful, fragile world. But I stopped myself, my hand hovering over the keypad. How could I? Her husband had just spent hours masterfully reinforcing the lie, soothing her terror, with a performance of such convincing grief that she was now more deeply entrenched in the deception than ever. To her, I would sound like a hysterical, confused old woman, perhaps even cruel for questioning her husband's profound tragedy. No, a direct confrontation was impossible. They had built a fortress of lies, and I could not simply knock on the gate. I had to find a way to dismantle it, stone by stone, from the inside out. My first and most crucial step was to find the real Mark, the man with the scar and the sad, weary eyes. I had to find him before my son-in-law, the man I now thought of only as Ethan, could silence him for good. The next morning I woke before dawn, the plan already forming in my mind with a chilling clarity. I couldn't go to the police. My story was too fantastic, a tale of ghosts and birthmarks that would be dismissed as the ramblings of a senior citizen. I was on my own. My only hope was that the real Mark, having been so brutally rejected by his brother, would not have gone far. He had come to my door looking for Clara, for a connection to the life that had been stolen from him. Perhaps he was still circling, a lost satellite in an orbit he could no longer occupy. I started by driving, my car a silent, prowling predator in the quiet suburban streets of my own neighborhood. I drove for hours, my eyes scanning every park bench, every coffee shop patio, every face on the sidewalk, searching for that uncanny yet flawed resemblance to the man my daughter had married. But the search was fruitless. He was gone, vanished as completely as he had appeared. A knot of panic began to tighten in my chest. What if Ethan had found him first? What if, after seeing him at my door, he had hunted him down to ensure his ghost remained a ghost? The thought was so terrifying that I had to pull my car over to the side of the road, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. I had to think more logically. Where would he go? He had nowhere to stay, likely no money. He was a man out of time, a phantom, looking for an anchor. He had tried my house. Where next? The answer came to me with a sudden, startling certainty. Ethan's office. It was the center of his stolen life, a public monument to the success he had built on his brother's grave. I drove downtown, my resolve hardening with every mile. The building that housed Thorn Financial, Ethan's firm, was an imposing tower of smoked glass and steel, a symbol of the wealth and power he had amassed. It was a world away from the worn canvas jacket and haunted eyes of the man I was searching for. I parked across the street, in a spot that gave me a clear view of the main entrance, and I began my stakeout. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a movie of someone else's life. This was not me. I was Helen, the gardener, the baker of cookies for school fundraisers, the quiet, respectable widow. I was not a woman who conducted surveillance on her own family from a parked car. Yet here I was, my heart a cold, hard knot in my chest, my eyes scanning every face that passed through the revolving doors. Hours bled into one another. I watched as Ethan, my daughter's husband, arrived in his sleek black Mercedes, looking every bit the part of the financial titan, his tailored suit a perfect armor against the world. He exuded an aura of confident success, and the sight of it, knowing the lie it was built upon, made me physically ill. I watched him disappear into the tower, and I waited, fueled by coffee from a thermos and a righteous fury that burned brighter than the afternoon sun. I would wait for as long as it took. Just as the downtown lunch crowd began to thin, my patience was rewarded. I saw him. The real Mark was standing across the street, partially hidden by the shade of an awning, his posture a study in hopeless longing. He was staring up at the monolithic building, at the name Thorn Financial, etched in chrome above the door, with an expression of such profound loss that it took my breath away. He looked like a man staring at his own gravestone, a monument to a life he was supposed to have lived. He made no move to go inside. He simply stood there, a ghost haunting the edges of his own stolen existence, invisible to the world that rushed past him. This was my chance. My heart pounding, I got out of the car, my movements quick and decisive. I crossed the street, dodging a stream of yellow cabs, my eyes locked on him. He didn't notice me until I was just a few feet away. When he finally saw me, a look of alarm, of a cornered animal, flashed across his face. He took a step back, ready to bolt. "Wait," I said, my voice low and urgent, trying to convey a sincerity he had no reason to trust. "Please, don't run. I know who you are, and I believe you." His body remained tense, his eyes narrowed with suspicion, but he didn't run. He was searching my face, looking for the trick, the trap. "You're her mother," he stated, his voice flat. "You threw me off your porch." "My daughter was terrified," I explained, taking another slow step closer. "She was seeing a man she has believed to be dead for 10 years. But I know the truth. I know my son-in-law is lying." I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a desperate, fragile hope. "How?" he asked, the single word filled with a decade of pain and disbelief. I didn't want to explain on a busy downtown street. I looked around at the bustling city, at the endless stream of strangers. "We can't talk here," I said. "Let me take you somewhere safe, somewhere we can talk without being seen. Please, you have to trust me. Right now, I might be the only ally you have in the world." He stared at me for a long, agonizing moment, his internal battle playing out across his features. Finally, with a weary, almost imperceptible nod, he surrendered. We walked back to my car in silence, two strangers united by a devastating secret, leaving the gleaming tower of lies behind us as we drove towards the uncertain territory of the truth. I took him to a small, quiet diner on the outskirts of the city, a place with worn vinyl booths and the comforting smell of old coffee, a place so removed from Ethan's world that it felt like a sanctuary. We sat in a corner booth, the silence stretching between us as the waitress poured 2 cups of coffee. When she left, he finally spoke, his eyes fixed on the swirling steam rising from his cup. "He told you I was a con artist," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "He said someone was preying on your family's grief." I nodded. His performance was very convincing, but there was one detail he couldn't fake. I then told him about the photograph from Mexico, about the crescent moon birthmark on his brother's shoulder, and about my sudden, vivid memory of his own unmarked arm. As I spoke, I saw the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. For the first time since I had met him, he looked at me not with suspicion, but with a glimmer of trust. He finally had someone who believed him, someone who had seen the lie with her own eyes. The small, irrefutable detail of a birthmark was the key that had finally unlocked his prison of disbelief. Then, he began to tell his story, his voice low and raspy, the sound of a man who had not had a reason to speak his truth in a very long time. He spoke of his childhood, of an inseparable bond with his identical twin, a bond so deep they were like 2 halves of a single soul. He then described the boating accident, the memory still raw and vivid, even after a decade. He remembered the sudden, violent storm, the boat overturning, the shock of the icy water. He remembered being thrown clear, his head striking a piece of floating wreckage. His last memory was of the dark, churning water closing over him. He had woken up weeks later, in a small, rural hospital, hundreds of miles away, his body battered, his mind a complete and utter blank. He had no name, no past, no memory of the boy who had been his other half. He was a John Doe, a ghost with no history. The scar on his eyebrow was a permanent reminder of the moment his life had been violently erased, a physical mark of the day he had ceased to exist. He had been released from the hospital into a world he didn't recognize. With no identification and no memory, he was trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare. He took on the name John, a name as anonymous as he felt, and for the next 10 years, he lived a life of transient hardship. He worked manual labor jobs, on fishing boats and construction sites, moving from one small town to the next, always feeling like a man out of place, haunted by a sense of a life he was supposed to have lived but couldn't remember. He described the loneliness as a physical ache, a constant companion. Then, 6 months ago, while working a demolition job, a falling piece of debris struck him on the head. The second blow, miraculously, did not kill him, but instead acted like a key, unlocking the rusted doors of his memory. It all came flooding back in a torrent of chaotic images and sounds. His parents' faces, his childhood home, the lake, the storm, and most vividly of all, his brother's face, screaming his name as the waves pulled them apart. He finally remembered who he was. Mark Thorne. Armed with his own name, he began a desperate search. He discovered his parents had died years ago. He found his own death certificate, dated 2 weeks after the boating accident. The world, officially, believed he was dead, but his search also led him to a stunning discovery. His brother Ethan was not only alive, but thriving, living in a city just a state away, a wealthy and successful man. He found pictures of Ethan online, and with them, pictures of a beautiful woman named Clara, his wife. He felt a surge of joyous relief. His brother was alive. He had a family. He had a life. He made his way here, his heart filled with a nervous, hopeful anticipation of a miraculous reunion. He went to their beautiful home, the home that should have been his, and knocked on the door. When his own identical twin opened it, the face he had dreamed of for a decade, the reaction was not the joyful shock he had expected. It was a look of pure, unadulterated terror, followed by a cold, reptilian fury. Ethan had slammed the door in his face, hissing through the wood. "You're dead. Stay dead. If you ever come near me or my family again, I will destroy you." My heart broke for him as he told the final, devastating part of his story. The brother he had come back from the dead to find had not just moved on. He had actively stolen Mark's life and then brutally rejected his return. Ethan had not been grieving. He had been liberated. He had taken his brother's name, his identity, and built a new, better life on the lie of his death. "He's not my brother anymore," Mark said, his voice cracking with a decade of suppressed grief. "The man living with your daughter, the man who calls himself Mark, is Ethan. He was always the ambitious one, the one who resented living in my shadow. He saw the accident, not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity." I reached across the table and placed my hand over his, the first physical contact between us. "He is not going to get away with this," I said, my voice filled with a cold, hard certainty that surprised even me. "My daughter's entire life is a lie. Your entire life was stolen. We are not going to let him win. You and I, we are going to expose him. We are going to take back everything he has stolen." In the quiet, unassuming diner, an unlikely and powerful alliance was forged, born from two different worlds but united by a shared, catastrophic betrayal. The immediate, pressing concern was Mark's safety. He was a ghost in a world that had erased him, and his very existence was a direct threat to the powerful, fraudulent life his brother had built. Ethan, having already slammed the door on his resurrected twin, would not be content to simply hope he disappeared again. He would be hunting him. My quiet suburban home, once a sanctuary, was now the most dangerous place Mark could be. It was the first place Ethan would look if his suspicions were aroused. I knew I had to get Mark off the grid, to tuck him away somewhere safe where we could plan our next move without the constant fear of discovery. I drove him to a small, nondescript motel on the far side of town, a place of peeling paint and flickering neon signs, a world away from the manicured lawns of my neighborhood and the gleaming steel of Ethan's financial empire. I paid for a week in cash, registering him under the anonymous name he had used for a decade, John Smith. The room was sparse and smelled of stale cigarette smoke, but it was a fortress of anonymity, and for now, that was all that mattered. As I left him there, with a promise to return the next morning with a burner phone and a change of clothes, I felt the profound and irreversible shift in my own identity. I was no longer just Helen, the grieving widow and doting mother. I had become a co-conspirator, a strategist, a woman willing to operate in the shadows to protect the innocent and expose the guilty. This new role felt both terrifying and strangely empowering, as if a dormant, fiercer version of myself had been awakened by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. The next morning, in the dim light of the motel room, Mark and I laid out the few facts we possessed on the scarred Formica table. The crescent moon birthmark was our cornerstone, a piece of irrefutable physical evidence, but it wasn't enough. In a court of law, or even in the court of my daughter's opinion, it could be dismissed or explained away. We needed more. We needed to find a crack in the fortress of Ethan's fabricated past, a detail so specific, so personal, that only the real Mark Thorne would know it. "Think, Mark," I urged, my voice low and intense. "Think back before the accident. Is there anything, an object, a secret, a shared memory, that Ethan couldn't possibly know?" He closed his eyes, his face a mask of concentration, as he dredged the depths of his newly returned memory. He spoke of childhood forts and secret handshakes, but these were memories Ethan would share. Then, he paused, his eyes snapping open. "The lockbox," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Our father had a small, fireproof lockbox he kept in his study. He told us that inside it was our real inheritance, not money, but our history. The week before we left for the lake, he gave us each a key. He made us promise to always keep it safe, that if anything ever happened to him, the contents of that box would be our guide. A surge of adrenaline shot through me. This was it. This was the kind of detail an imposter would overlook or assume was lost forever. "Where is this box?" I asked, leaning forward, my heart pounding. Mark's face clouded with uncertainty. "That's the problem. After our parents died, the house was sold. All their belongings were put into a long-term storage unit. Ethan was the executor. He handled everything. I have no idea where that unit is, or if it even still exists." A wave of frustration washed over me, the promising lead dissolving into another dead end. But then, Mark's expression changed again, a new memory surfacing. "But I know who might," he said, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "My father's lawyer, a man named Arthur Vance. He was an old family friend, more like an uncle to us. He handled all of my parents' affairs, including the storage arrangements. If anyone knows where that box is, it would be him." The name Arthur Vance was my new beacon. I knew I couldn't approach him as myself, the mother-in-law of the man he likely knew as Mark Thorne. The questions would be too direct, too suspicious. I had to create a plausible reason for my inquiry, a story that would allow me to probe for information without setting off any alarms. I would have to become an actress, playing the part of the devoted mother-in-law, a role I knew all too well, but this time it would be for a very different purpose. That afternoon I found a listing for Vance & Associates Estate Law in an old phone book. Arthur Vance was still practicing, his office located in a stately, ivy-covered building in the city's historic legal district. I called and made an appointment, my story already carefully constructed in my mind. When I met with him the next day, he was a kind, elderly man with a warm smile and gentle, intelligent eyes, the very picture of a trustworthy family lawyer. I explained that I was Clara's mother, and that my daughter and I were planning a surprise for Mark's upcoming 40th birthday. "We want to create a This Is Your Lifestyle scrapbook for him," I said, my voice filled with a fabricated, cheerful enthusiasm. "But as you know, he lost everything from his childhood. We were hoping you might have some old documents or photographs from his parents' estate that we could include. Anything to help him reconnect with his past." Arthur's smile grew warmer, his eyes shining with affection for the boy he had helped raise. "What a wonderful idea, Helen," he said. "Mark was such a fine young man, and what happened to his brother was a terrible tragedy. I'd be happy to help in any way I can." He saw me as an ally, a fellow keeper of Mark's story, and in that moment, I felt a sharp, bitter pang of guilt for the deception I was about to perpetrate. I spent the next hour with Arthur, listening to him reminisce about the Thorne family. He spoke of two bright, energetic boys who were as different as they were identical. "Mark was the steady one," he said with a fond smile. "Responsible, kind, a natural leader. Ethan was the firecracker, a brilliant mind, but always a bit wild, always chasing something bigger, better, faster." His words painted a picture that aligned perfectly with the two men I had now met. Arthur then went to a large filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder labeled Thorne Estate. He sifted through the old documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I don't have many photographs," he said apologetically, "but I do have this." He pulled out a document, an inventory list, from the storage unit. My eyes scanned the page, my heart pounding with anticipation. And then I saw it, listed under Personal Effects, Box 7 inches, 1-1, Black, Fireproof Lockbox, Personal Documents. I tried to keep my expression neutral, my voice casual. "Oh, that sounds intriguing," I said lightly. "Do you know where this storage facility is? Perhaps there's something in that box we could use." Arthur shook his head sadly. "Unfortunately, that unit was closed out years ago. When your Mark, turned 30, he took possession of everything. He had it all moved to a private facility of his choosing. I'm afraid I don't know where that is. He handled it all himself." My heart sank. Another dead end. Ethan had the box. He had likely either destroyed it or hidden it away, burying the last remnants of his brother's history. But Arthur wasn't finished. "However," he continued, a thoughtful expression on his face, "I do remember something interesting about that box. Your father-in-law was a very cautious man. He was worried about the boys losing their keys, so he left a third, spare key with me for safekeeping, just in case of an emergency. He opened a small, locked drawer in his desk and pulled out a small manila envelope. He made me promise to only give it to one of the boys if they both came to me together, a little test to make sure they were still united. But given the circumstances, he trailed off, his eyes sad. He opened the envelope and tipped a small, ornate silver key into his palm. I don't see the harm in you having it. Perhaps the box is still in Mark's possession, tucked away in his attic somewhere. Finding this key might be a wonderful surprise for him. I accepted the key, my hand closing around the cold, heavy metal. It felt like a sacred artifact, a key not just to a box but to the entire, tangled history of this family. I thanked Arthur profusely, my heart singing with a silent, triumphant joy. I now had a way in. That evening, I had to endure one of the most difficult phone calls of my life. Clara called, her voice brighter and more relaxed than it had been in days. "Mom, I just wanted to thank you for being so supportive," she said. "Mark and I had a long talk last night. He told me more about Ethan, about how much he misses him. It's been so hard for him, carrying that grief alone for so long. Having that horrible man show up just brought it all back to the surface. But we're okay now. We're stronger than ever." Every word was a dagger, twisting in the wound of my knowledge. She was describing Ethan's masterful manipulation, his ability to turn his own crime into a source of sympathy, to strengthen his bond with her through a shared, fabricated trauma. I had to bite my tongue to keep from screaming the truth. Instead, I played my part. "I'm so glad, sweetheart," I said, my voice carefully modulated to sound warm and reassuring. "He is a wonderful man, and he is lucky to have you." As I hung up the phone, a cold, hard certainty settled over me. I could not let my daughter live one more day inside this lie. The risk was immense, but I had to get into their house. I had to find that lockbox. Mark and I met again in the motel room, the single silver key lying on the table between us like a holy relic. When I told him what Arthur had said about his father's test to ensure the brothers remained united, his eyes filled with tears. "My father knew," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "He knew Ethan had a reckless streak. He was trying to protect us, even from beyond the grave." The discovery of the key had unlocked not just a potential path to the truth, but a flood of memories for Mark. He remembered his father's study, the smell of old books and leather, the weight of the lockbox in his hands. He also remembered something crucial, a detail that made my blood run cold. "The box contained more than just our history," Mark said, his gaze distant. "It held the original documents for a trust fund our grandfather had set up for us. It was to be split evenly between us on our 40th birthday. Ethan knew about it. He had always been obsessed with it." Suddenly the motive, the final, ugly piece of the puzzle, slammed into place. This wasn't just about identity theft. It was about money. A lot of money. The boating accident had occurred just a few months before their 30th birthday, the day Ethan had gained sole access to their parents' belongings, including the box. He hadn't just stolen a life, he had stolen a future, a fortune. The stakes were now higher than I could have ever imagined. Ethan was not just a liar, he was a thief who had potentially tried to murder his own brother for a trust fund. This knowledge changed everything. Our mission was no longer simply about revealing an identity. It was about exposing a dangerous criminal who had woven himself into the very fabric of my daughter's life. "I have to get into that house," I said, my voice low and determined. "They're going to a charity gala on Friday night. I know their schedule. Clara told me about it. They'll be gone for at least 5 hours." The plan began to form, risky and audacious, but absolutely necessary. I would use the spare key Clara had given me for emergencies, the one that hung on a hook in my kitchen, a symbol of the trust my daughter had in me, a trust I was now forced to betray in order to save her. I would enter their perfect, beautiful home not as a loving mother, but as a burglar, a truth seeker, searching for a lockbox that held the key to my daughter's freedom and a brother's justice. Mark's face was a mixture of hope and terror. "It's too dangerous, Helen," he argued. "If he catches you—" "He won't," I interrupted, my voice leaving no room for argument. "He thinks I'm a harmless old woman who is completely fooled by his act. He thinks he is invincible, and that is his greatest weakness." I looked at the silver key, its ornate design glinting in the dim motel light. It was a key from a dead father to his 2 sons, a test of their bond that had been tragically, catastrophically failed. But now, it had been passed to me. It was a key that could unlock a decade of lies, a key that could expose a thief and a potential murderer, a key that could, I prayed, finally set my daughter free. The plan was set. On Friday night, while the high society of the city toasted to charity and my daughter smiled on the arm of a monster, I would be moving through the shadows of their perfect house, searching for a small, black box that held the power to either save us or destroy us all. Friday night descended upon the city with an air of glamour and expectation, but for me it was a night cloaked in dread and a steely, unfamiliar resolve. I watched from the window of my darkened living room as a black town car pulled up to Clara and Ethan's house across the street. I saw my daughter emerge, a vision in a shimmering emerald gown, her laughter carrying on the still night air. Ethan followed, looking dashing and impossibly handsome in a tailored tuxedo, his hand possessively on the small of her back. They were the picture of success and happiness, a golden couple on their way to a glittering charity gala, completely oblivious to the fact that their carefully constructed world was about to be invaded. I waited for a full hour after they left, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, giving them ample time to be seen, to be established at their event, a public alibi for the crime I was about to commit against them. Finally, clutching the spare key Clara had given me years ago in one hand and a small, powerful flashlight in the other, I slipped out of my house and across the quiet, tree-lined street. The key, once a symbol of my maternal trust, now felt like a burglar's tool. It slid into the lock of their front door with a soft, sickening click. I stepped inside, into the heart of the lie, the air cool and silent, smelling faintly of Clara's expensive floral perfume. The house, a place where I had attended countless happy family dinners, now felt alien and menacing, each shadow holding a potential secret, each familiar object tainted by the profound deception of its owner. My target was Ethan's home office, a room I knew he considered his private sanctuary, a place Clara rarely entered. It was a monument to the man he pretended to be, all dark wood, supple leather, and gleaming chrome. A massive mahogany desk dominated the space, its surface clear and uncluttered, a testament to a ruthlessly organized mind. The walls were lined not with family photos, but with framed awards and certificates of financial achievement, a shrine to his stolen success. I began my search with a methodical desperation, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I checked every drawer in the desk, rifling through perfectly organized files that revealed nothing more than his legitimate business dealings. I searched the walk-in closet, patting down the pockets of his expensive suits, my hands brushing against the fine wool and silk of a life built on a lie. I looked behind the heavy velvet curtains and under the plush, Persian rug. Nothing. Time was a tangible, menacing presence in the room, each tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway a reminder that my window of opportunity was shrinking. A cold sweat beaded on my forehead. What if it wasn't here? What if, after all this, Ethan had been clever enough to hide the one piece of his past he couldn't afford to have found? The thought was a chilling wave of despair, but I pushed it down, my fury a burning ember that would not be extinguished so easily. I would not leave this house without it. As I was running my hands along the baseboards behind a leather armchair, a soft chime emanated from the desk. I froze, my blood turning to ice. A notification had lit up the screen of his large desktop computer. I crept closer, my heart in my throat. It was a text message, synced from his phone, displayed on the screen. It was from Clara. "Having a wonderful time, my love," the message read, accompanied by a string of heart emojis. "But I have the strangest feeling tonight, like I'm being watched." Silly, I know. Everything is okay at home, right? I held my breath, waiting for his reply, a voyeur to my daughter's innocent plea for reassurance from the monster who was deceiving her. A moment later, his response appeared. "Everything is perfect, darling. You are just being paranoid. Have another glass of champagne and stop worrying. I love you." The casual, dismissive cruelty of his lie was a physical blow. He was so adept at it, so effortlessly charming in his deception. The close call, the near discovery, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through me, but it also hardened my resolve into something sharp and dangerous. He was not just a liar. He was a master manipulator who treated my daughter's intuition as a silly, childish fear. I would not fail. I owed it to Clara to see this through, to tear down the facade he had so masterfully constructed around her. I turned my attention away from the conventional hiding spots, my mind replaying Arthur Vance's words. Your father-in-law was a very cautious man. He loved puzzles. Richard, the real Richard, had been a man of intricate hobbies, a builder of model ships and a solver of complex crosswords. He would not have hidden something so important in a place so obvious. Ethan, in his arrogance, had likely preserved the box, seeing it as a trophy of his victory, but he would have honored his father's love for concealment. My eyes scanned the room again, this time looking not for a space to hide something, but for a feature that was, in itself, a hiding place. My gaze fell upon the massive, floor-to-ceiling bookshelf that dominated one entire wall. It was a custom piece, filled with leather-bound books that looked as if they had never been opened. It was a prop, a piece of stage dressing for the role of a learned, successful man. I ran my flashlight beam over the intricate woodwork, the carved panels and ornate moldings. It all seemed perfect, seamless. But then I saw it. On the third shelf, one of the decorative carved rosettes in the corner panel was slightly discolored, its varnish worn away as if from repeated secret pressure. My breath hitched. With trembling fingers, I reached up and pressed firmly on the rosette. For a moment, nothing happened. My heart sank with disappointment. But then I heard it. A soft, mechanical click, the sound of a well-oiled secret surrendering. The entire panel of the bookshelf swung inwards silently, revealing a dark, square cavity built into the wall behind it. And there, nestled on a small shelf inside, was a small, black, fireproof lockbox. A wave of triumphant, almost dizzying relief washed over me. I had found it. It was real. I reached into the hidden compartment, my fingers closing around the cold, heavy metal of the box. I pulled it out and carried it to the desk, my movements now filled with a sense of sacred purpose. I retrieved the small, ornate silver key from my pocket. It slid into the lock with a perfect, satisfying precision. I took a deep, shuddering breath, a silent prayer on my lips, and turned the key. The lock sprung open with a sharp, definitive click. The sound echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. The sound of a decade of lies finally being brought to an end. With a hand that was surprisingly steady, I lifted the lid of the box, opening a Pandora's box of stolen history and buried crimes, knowing that whatever I found inside would change all of our lives forever. The first items I lifted from the box were a stack of old, yellowed papers tied together with a faded red ribbon. I carefully untied the ribbon and spread the contents out under the beam of my flashlight. It was their history. There were 2 birth certificates for Mark and Ethan Thorne, born just 7 minutes apart. There were their school report cards, a side-by-side chronicle of their diverging paths. Mark's grades were steady and consistent, his teachers' comments praising his diligence and kindness. Ethan's were a volatile mix of brilliant A's and near-failing D's, his comments filled with words like disruptive, arrogant, and fails to apply his considerable intellect. There were letters from their father, written on his business trips, filled with loving advice and paternal pride. Be good to each other, one letter read. You are 2 halves of the same whole. Your greatest strength will always be your bond. Reading those words, knowing how catastrophically that bond had been broken, was a grief so profound it felt like my own. This was not just evidence. This was the soul of a family, a soul that Ethan had tried to murder and bury. I felt a surge of righteous fury on behalf of the father, who had so desperately wanted his sons to remain united. Beneath the personal documents was a thick, legal-sized folder. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were the trust fund documents Mark had told me about. The legalese was dense, but the numbers were stark and unambiguous. The fund, upon their 40th birthday, was worth over $5 million. The terms were ironclad, to be split evenly between the 2 brothers. If one brother were deceased, the entire amount would go to the sole survivor. Ethan's 40th birthday had been 6 months ago. The motive was no longer a theory. It was a $5 million fact, outlined in cold, hard print. But there was more. Tucked behind the trust documents was another policy, one Mark had never mentioned, one he likely never knew existed. It was a life insurance policy, taken out by Ethan on Mark's life just 2 months before the boating accident. The payout was a cool $1 million. The beneficiary was Ethan Thorne, his brother. My blood ran cold. This was no longer just a story of identity theft and greed. This was premeditated. The boating accident was not an accident at all. Ethan had not just seized an opportunity. He had created it. He had tried to murder his own brother for $6 million. At the very bottom of the box, tucked inside a small, plain envelope, was the most chilling discovery of all. It was a single, faded color photograph. It showed a much younger Ethan, his face unlined by the feigned success he now wore like a mask. He was standing on a wooden pier, the water of a lake stretching out behind him. In the background, a small-town newspaper stand was clearly visible. I angled my flashlight, my heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm, and zoomed in on the headline of the paper. Search continues for missing boater, Mark Thorne. My eyes then moved to Ethan's face. He was not grieving. He was not worried. He was looking directly at the camera, and on his face was a small, smug, utterly triumphant smirk. It was the look of a man who had just gotten away with the perfect crime. The look of a predator who had successfully eliminated his only rival. The photograph was a silent, damning confession. A portrait of a man not in mourning, but in victory. The ghost on my porch was not a con artist. He was a survivor of his own attempted murder. I worked quickly then, my movements precise and efficient, all fear replaced by a cold, surgical rage. I laid out every single document on the dark mahogany of the desk. The birth certificates, the report cards, the father's letters, the trust fund agreement, the life insurance policy, and finally, the smiling sociopathic photograph. Using my phone, I took high-resolution pictures of every page, of every damning word, of every single digit of his stolen fortune. I created a digital archive of his crimes, a complete and irrefutable chronicle of his monstrous betrayal. When I was finished, I carefully placed every item back into the lockbox, just as I had found it. I closed the lid, locked it, and returned the box to its hidden compartment. The faint click of the closing panel, the only sound in the silent room. I left the house as I had entered it, a silent ghost in the night, the heavy velvet darkness of the perfect home swallowing up any trace of my presence. As I walked back across the street, the cool night air feeling crisp and clean against my flushed cheeks, I felt not fear, but a profound, almost terrifying sense of power. I was no longer just a mother, seeking to protect her daughter. I was an avenging angel, armed with the truth. I had the weapon I needed to utterly destroy him. The hunt was over. The war was about to begin. The plan to expose him could not be a simple confrontation. A quiet conversation behind closed doors, a tearful confession. These were tools for a family with a conscience, and Ethan had proven he had none. No, his downfall had to be as public and as spectacular as the life he had built for himself. It had to be a demolition, a complete and utter leveling of his fraudulent world in front of the very people whose admiration he had so carefully cultivated. The charity gala, the glittering event he was attending at this very moment, was the perfect stage. It was the pinnacle of his stolen social life. A room filled with the city's wealthiest and most influential people, all of them convinced he was Mark Thorne, the tragic but resilient financial prodigy. I drove not home but towards the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive hotel, the digital evidence on my phone a ticking time bomb. I called Mark, who had been waiting in an agony of suspense in his lonely motel room. "I have it," I said, my voice low and steady. "I have everything. Meet me at the hotel. It ends tonight." I could hear his sharp intake of breath, a sound of disbelief and dawning, terrified hope. The final act was about to begin, and the curtain was about to rise on a performance of truth and justice that would bring the entire, rotten edifice of Ethan's life crashing down around him. I arrived at the Grand Hotel, the entrance a glittering spectacle of valet attendants and flashing cameras from the local society pages. The opulent ballroom was a world away from the quiet, vengeful solitude of my own home, a cacophony of clinking champagne flutes, orchestral music, and the self-important murmur of the city's elite. I felt like an imposter, a ghost at their feast, my simple black dress, a stark contrast to the designer gowns and jewels that surrounded me. But the cold, hard weight of the digital evidence on my phone was a talisman, a source of strength that made me immune to the glamour and intimidation of the room. I saw them from across the crowded ballroom, Clara and Ethan, holding court near the main stage. My daughter was radiant, her emerald gown catching the light, her face animated as she laughed at something a portly man in a tuxedo said. Ethan was the picture of suave success, his hand resting proprietarily on Clara's back, a confident smile playing on his lips. He was a king in his stolen castle, utterly oblivious to the fact that the castle walls were about to come crashing down. I found a secluded alcove near the back of the ballroom, partially hidden by a large potted palm, and I waited, my eyes never leaving the golden couple, my heart a steady, cold metronome, counting down the final moments of their fraudulent life. This was the stage he had chosen, and I would ensure it was the stage for his final, unforgettable performance. A few minutes later, Mark slipped into the ballroom, his presence a jarring note of reality in the symphony of artifice. He was wearing the new, simple suit I had bought for him that afternoon, but he looked deeply uncomfortable, his shoulders tense, his eyes wide and overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the wealth and power on display. This was the life that should have been his, a world he was now seeing for the first time as an outsider. He saw me in the alcove and came over, his movements furtive, like a man who was not used to being seen. "This is insane," he whispered, his gaze sweeping across the room. "He built all this on my grave." I took his hand, my grip firm and reassuring. "He built it on a lie," I corrected him gently. "And lies have a way of collapsing." I showed him the pictures on my phone, the final, damning pieces of evidence from the lockbox. When he saw the photograph of Ethan smirking on the pier, the newspaper headline announcing his own disappearance in the background, a shudder racked his body. The last vestiges of any brotherly sentiment, any lingering doubt, were incinerated in that single sociopathic image. A new, hard light entered his eyes, the look of a man who was no longer just a victim, but a survivor ready to fight for his own justice. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice now steady, his resolve finally matching my own. I outlined the plan, simple, audacious, and utterly devastating. His downfall would not be a whisper, it would be a roar. Leaving Mark in the shadows of the alcove, I moved through the crowd with a newfound sense of purpose. I was not just Clara's mother here. I was a long-standing member of this community, a familiar face at these charitable events for decades. I approached the event organizer, a flustered but well-meaning woman named Beatrice, her clipboard a shield against the chaos. "Beatrice, my dear," I began, my voice a carefully crafted blend of warmth and urgent sincerity. "I have a wonderful surprise for my son-in-law. It's a tribute video, a little something Clara and I put together to honor his incredible generosity and his resilience in the face of his family tragedy." Beatrice, charmed and eager to add another heartfelt moment to her program, beamed at me. "Helen, how lovely. Of course. When would you like to show it?" "Right after he gives his speech," I said, my smile never wavering. "He's the keynote speaker tonight, and I thought it would be the perfect, emotional follow-up." She readily agreed, taking the small USB drive from my hand without a second thought, seeing me as nothing more than a proud, sentimental mother-in-law. The ease with which she accepted my lie was a chilling reminder of how easily Ethan had been able to craft his own. People believed what they were told, especially when it was wrapped in a beautiful, heartwarming package. But the gift I was about to give this room was not heartwarming. It was a bomb. An hour later, the moment arrived. The ballroom lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the crowd as Ethan was introduced to a round of enthusiastic applause. He walked to the stage, the picture of humility and grace, and stood at the podium, basking in the warm glow of the spotlight. "To overcome personal tragedy," he began, his voice rich and resonant, "is one of life's greatest challenges. 10 years ago, I lost my other half, my twin brother Mark, in a terrible accident. I watched Clara from across the room, her eyes shining with tears of pride and love for her brave, resilient husband. My heart ached for the pain that was about to rip through her, but I knew it was a necessary, surgical pain, the kind that cuts away a cancer to save a life." Ethan continued his speech, his words a masterful tapestry of feigned grief and inspiring perseverance. He was at the absolute pinnacle of his fraudulent life, bathed in the admiration of a room full of people who believed his every word. As he reached the crescendo of his speech, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke of honoring his brother's memory, I caught Beatrice's eye across the room and gave her a subtle, prearranged nod. It was time. The tribute was about to begin. The massive screens behind Ethan, which had been displaying the charity's logo, flickered to black. The crowd murmured in anticipation of the surprise tribute. Then, the first image flashed onto the screens. Not a smiling photo of my son-in-law, but the stark black and white image of two identical birth certificates, for Mark and Ethan Thorne, side by side. A wave of confusion rippled through the ballroom. Ethan faltered at the podium, his confident smile faltering as he glanced behind him. Before he could react, the next image appeared. The two school report cards, a visual testament to their divergent characters. Then came their father's loving letters, his words about their unbreakable bond, now an indictment of the man on stage. The trust fund document appeared next, the $5 million motive displayed for all to see, followed by the $1 million life insurance policy taken out by Ethan. The whispers in the room grew to a roar of scandalized disbelief. And then came the final, soul-destroying image, the photograph of Ethan on the pier, his face frozen in a smug, triumphant smirk, the headline of his brother's disappearance, a clear and damning caption. Ethan stood frozen, a deer caught in the headlights of his own history, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. The room erupted into chaos. The carefully constructed facade of the elegant charity gala shattered into 1,000 pieces. As Ethan stood paralyzed on the stage, the lie he had lived for a decade exposed in the most public and humiliating way imaginable, a figure emerged from the shadows at the back of the ballroom. It was Mark. He began to walk slowly, deliberately, down the central aisle, his face calm, his gaze locked on his brother. The crowd parted before him as if for a specter, their gasps and pointed fingers creating a pathway. He was the living ghost, the impossible made real, the man with the scar on his eyebrow and the truth in his eyes. Clara, from her seat at the front table, saw him first. Her eyes darted from the impossible man walking towards the stage, to the smirking sociopath in the photograph on the screen, and finally, to the face of the husband she loved, now contorted in a mask of pure, guilty terror. A sound escaped her. The same sound I had heard on my porch, but this time it was not a scream of confusion. It was a scream of final, devastating, absolute understanding. The world she knew had just ceased to exist. Ethan, trapped between the irrefutable evidence on the screen behind him and the living proof of his crime walking towards him, finally broke. He scrambled from the podium, his polished grace dissolving into a clumsy, panicked flight. He made a desperate dash for a side exit, but he was intercepted by hotel security, who had been alerted by the sudden chaos. He was cornered, his beautiful tuxedo now looking like the costume of a failed magician, whose greatest trick had just been spectacularly revealed. I rushed to Clara's side, my arms wrapping around her as she collapsed into a state of catatonic shock. The emerald gown that had looked so beautiful just moments before now seemed like a cruel mockery of the life she thought she had. I held her close, murmuring words of comfort, no longer a co-conspirator in a vengeful plot, but simply a mother, there to catch her daughter as she fell from the ruins of her life. The public humiliation of Ethan was absolute. His downfall was not just a quiet discovery. It was a city-wide scandal, a spectacular implosion that would be the talk of the town for years to come. In the months that followed, the full, sordid story came out in a series of sensational headlines and a highly publicized trial. Faced with the mountain of evidence from the lockbox, Ethan confessed to everything: the identity theft, the financial fraud, and the attempted murder of his brother. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, his name forever synonymous with a betrayal of monstrous proportions. The $5 million trust fund, and what was left of Ethan's ill-gotten fortune, was rightfully restored to Mark, the man who had lost a decade of his life but had miraculously, against all odds, survived to reclaim it. It was a just and satisfying end, a clean victory in a war that had been fought in the shadows. But for Clara and me, the aftermath was a far more complicated landscape of pain and rebuilding. The man she had loved, the father of her future children she had dreamed of, was a monster, and that was a truth that could not be easily erased. Justice had been served, but our family was in ruins, and the long, difficult work of healing was just beginning. The path forward was not easy. Clara's grief was immense, a mourning not for the man Ethan was, but for the man she had believed him to be. She moved back in with me for a time, our shared home a quiet sanctuary, where she could slowly piece together the shattered fragments of her reality. And in that quiet space, Another relationship began to tentatively, cautiously form. Mark, now a wealthy man but still a stranger to his own life, began to visit. At first it was just to talk to me, to thank me, to navigate the legal complexities of his new reality. But slowly, he and Clara began to talk. They were two survivors of the same shipwreck, two people whose lives had been irrevocably shaped by the same man's lies. Their conversations were awkward and filled with the ghosts of the past, but they were also honest. They were building something new, not on the foundation of a fairy tale, but on the solid, unshakable ground of a shared, painful truth. There was no storybook romance, no instant connection. There was only the slow, difficult work of two broken people learning to trust again, finding in each other a reflection of their own survival. I often sit in my garden now, the scent of jasmine a sweet, comforting presence, and watch them as they talk on my porch. I lost the son-in-law I thought I knew, a perfect, charming man who never really existed. But in his place, I have found a new son, a real son, a man of quiet strength and profound resilience who has survived the unthinkable. And my daughter, my beautiful, strong Clara, she lost a husband, but she found her freedom. Our family is not the perfect picture it once was. It is a mosaic, pieced together from broken shards, the cracks still visible. But it is real, it is honest, and it is ours. We are not the golden couple and the doting mother from the storybook. We are three survivors, bound together not by a perfect past, but by the shared, difficult, and ultimately triumphant work of building a future out of the truth. The lies are all gone now, and in their place, something real has finally begun to grow. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you liked the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.